I never thought the phrase community college dropout could be wielded like a weapon until I married into the Morrison family. For 3 years, those words followed me into every family gathering, every holiday dinner, every casual conversation, where my mother-in-law Linda would introduce me to her friends with that particular smile that never reached her eyes. What they didn't know was that their precious family business, Morrison Associates Real Estate, had been surviving on loans I personally approved from behind my desk at First National Bank. Sometimes the people who look down on you the most are the ones whose livelihoods depend entirely on your signature. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first time I met David Morrison, I was working the night shift at Rosie's Diner on Highway 47, balancing plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes while dreams of finishing my business degree collected dust in my studio apartment. He walked in at 2 a.m. wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt and the kind of exhausted expression that comes from driving too many hours on empty highways. His order was simple: black coffee and apple pie. But the way he said please and thank you to every interaction made him stand out from the usual truckers and insomniacs who frequented our late-night crowd. David had been driving back from a real estate conference in Denver, trying to save money on hotels by pushing through the night instead of stopping. His family's business was struggling, he told me during one of those quiet 3 a.m. conversations that happen when two strangers find themselves awake while the rest of the world sleeps. Morrison Associates had been the premier real estate agency in Millbrook for 30 years, but recent economic downturns and increased competition from larger firms had eaten into their market share significantly. What struck me most about David wasn't his boyish charm or the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed at my sarcastic observations about late-night diner customers. It was his fundamental decency, the way he treated everyone with genuine respect regardless of their station in life. When Mrs. Patterson, our regular homeless customer, came in during David's third visit, he quietly paid for her meal without making a show of it. When I mentioned I was taking online business courses, he listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about my studies instead of offering patronizing encouragement. Our courtship unfolded in that diner booth over 6 months of his increasingly frequent late-night stops. David would drive the hour from Millbrook just to sit in my section, nursing coffee and working on real estate contracts while I finished my shift. He never pressured me to talk when the dinner rush kept me busy, but during the quiet hours, we shared stories about our dreams, our fears, our completely different backgrounds that somehow seemed to complement rather than clash. David came from what he described as old Millbrook money, though I would later learn this was a generous interpretation of the Morrison family's financial situation. His grandfather had started Morrison and Associates in the 1960s, building a solid reputation through honest dealings and deep community connections. His father, Robert, had expanded the business during the boom years of the 1980s and 1990s, but recent challenges had left the agency struggling to maintain its former prominence. My background was considerably more modest. I had grown up in foster care after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8 years old. The system had shuffled me between homes throughout my teenage years, making it difficult to maintain consistent schooling or develop lasting relationships. I had managed to graduate high school and start community college with grants and part-time work, but financial pressures had forced me to drop out after 2 semesters to work full-time. The diner job paid enough to cover rent and groceries, but barely left room for luxuries like continuing education. I had been slowly taking online courses when I could afford them, chipping away at a business degree that seemed to recede further into the future with each passing month. David's encouragement and genuine belief in my abilities gave me hope that maybe, somehow, I could build something better for myself. When David finally asked me to dinner at an actual restaurant instead of my workplace, I almost said no. Not because I didn't want to go, but because I was terrified of stepping into his world and being found lacking. The diner was my territory, where my competence and quick wit could shine. A proper restaurant felt like foreign territory where I might embarrass myself or him with wrong choices about silverware or wine. David seemed to understand my hesitation without me having to explain it. He chose a casual family restaurant in the next town over, somewhere comfortable but not intimidating. Over chicken parmesan and breadsticks, he told me more about his family and their expectations for his future. The Morrison name carried weight in Millbrook's social circles, he explained, though he sometimes felt suffocated by the pressure to maintain appearances and uphold traditions he wasn't sure he actually believed in. His parents had specific ideas about appropriate partners for their only son. Linda Morrison, his mother, had been president of the Millbrook Garden Club for 15 years and served on various charity boards throughout the county. She expected David to marry someone from their social circle, preferably someone whose family connections could benefit the real estate business. Robert Morrison, his father, was more pragmatic but equally focused on preserving the family legacy and ensuring the business's continuation through advantageous social and professional connections. David admitted with obvious discomfort that previous relationships had ended when girlfriends felt overwhelmed by his family's scrutiny and expectations. Women from their social circle often felt more interested in the Morrison name and financial prospects than in David himself, while women from different backgrounds found the family dynamics too challenging to navigate long-term. He had started to wonder if he would ever find someone who could love him for himself, while also finding a way to coexist with his family's complicated dynamics. As our relationship deepened over the following months, I got my first real glimpse into the Morrison family world during David's birthday celebration. The gathering was held at their family home, a sprawling Tudor revival house in Millbrook's historic district that spoke of old money and established social position. The guest list included business associates, family friends, and various members of Millbrook's social elite, all gathered to celebrate David's 28th birthday. I had spent hours choosing an appropriate outfit, settling on a simple black dress that I hoped would blend in without drawing unwanted attention. David had coached me on names and relationships, trying to prepare me for the complex social dynamics I would encounter. Despite his preparation, nothing could have readied me for the reality of walking into that world as clearly an outsider attempting to navigate unfamiliar territory. Linda Morrison greeted me with the kind of smile that managed to be simultaneously welcoming and assessing. She was an elegant woman in her early 50s, perfectly coiffed and dressed in clothing that whispered rather than shouted its expense. Her handshake was firm, her eye contact direct, and her questions about my background delivered with surgical precision disguised as polite conversation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Where had I grown up? What did my parents do? Where had I gone to school? Each question felt like a test I was destined to fail, particularly when my honest answers about foster care, community college, and diner work landed in the conversation, like stones dropped into still water. Linda's smile never wavered, but I could see her mentally cataloging each response and finding them insufficient, according to whatever criteria she used to evaluate her son's romantic interests. Robert Morrison was less subtle in his assessment. A large man with graying hair and the hearty handshake of someone accustomed to closing deals, he asked direct questions about my career goals and financial prospects. When I mentioned my online business courses, he nodded politely but with obvious skepticism about the value of education that didn't come from traditional four-year institutions. His suggestion that David could help me find more suitable employment in one of their business associates' companies carried the clear implication that my current work was beneath the standards expected of someone dating a Morrison. Throughout the evening, I found myself constantly conscious of being observed and evaluated by David's parents and their friends. Conversations would pause when I joined groups, restart with slightly altered topics, and often drift toward references and experiences I couldn't share. The wine selection, vacation destinations, exclusive social clubs, cultural events, all discussed with casual familiarity that highlighted my outsider status without anyone having to explicitly acknowledge it. David tried his best to include me and bridge the gaps, but I could see the strain on him as well. He was caught between his genuine affection for me and his awareness of his family's disapproval, trying to defend my worth without appearing to reject their values entirely. The evening felt like a delicate diplomatic mission, where one wrong move could create lasting damage to relationships on both sides. The drive home was quiet, both of us processing what had occurred. David apologized repeatedly for his family's behavior, though he struggled to articulate exactly what they had done wrong since their rudeness had been so expertly disguised as polite interest. I assured him that I understood the challenges and wasn't giving up on our relationship. But privately, I wondered if love would be enough to overcome such fundamental differences in background and expectations. That birthday party set the tone for my relationship with the Morrison family over the following months. Every interaction felt like a continuation of that initial assessment, with Linda and Robert maintaining polite facades while making their disapproval increasingly clear. Through subtle comments and pointed suggestions, family dinners became exercises in endurance, social gatherings felt like minefields of potential embarrassment, and holiday celebrations carried undertones of tension that no amount of seasonal cheer could completely mask. Linda developed a particular talent for backhanded compliments and seemingly innocent questions that highlighted my perceived shortcomings. She would praise my practical approach to fashion, ask if I was comfortable in certain social situations, and express admiration for people who could make something of themselves despite challenging circumstances. Each comment was carefully crafted to sound supportive while reinforcing the message that I was fundamentally different from their family and social circle. Robert's approach was more direct, but equally damaging. He would ask about my job prospects, suggest career paths that might be more appropriate for someone in my position, and make casual references to the importance of matching educational and social backgrounds in successful marriages. His tone remained friendly and paternalistic, but his message was clear. I was a temporary distraction that David would eventually outgrow as he matured and recognized his responsibilities to family and social position. Despite these challenges, my relationship with David continued to deepen. Away from his family's influence, we discovered shared values and compatible dreams that made the external pressures seem manageable. David's essential kindness and respect for others, regardless of their background, aligned perfectly with my own beliefs about human dignity and worth. We both valued hard work, honesty, and genuine connection over artificial social markers and inherited privilege. David also began to see his family's behavior more clearly through my experiences. Incidents that he had previously dismissed as normal social dynamics now appeared obviously problematic when he watched them targeting someone he loved. The casual classism, the automatic assumptions about worth based on education and employment, the way his parents' friends treated service workers and anyone outside their social circle, all became visible to him in ways they had never been before. As our relationship moved toward serious commitment, the pressure from his family intensified. Linda began arranging social events that deliberately excluded me, inviting David to gatherings where eligible women from appropriate families would be present. Robert started discussions about David's future role in the business, conversations that always seemed to include references to the importance of advantageous marriages in building professional networks and social capital. The breaking point came during Christmas of our second year together. David had proposed the previous month with a simple but beautiful ring that represented months of saving on his modest real estate agent salary. The engagement was supposed to be a celebration, but the Morrison family's reaction turned it into something closer to a funeral wake. Linda's response to our engagement news was a long silence, followed by careful questions about our timeline and plans. Had we really thought this through? Were we sure we weren't rushing into something neither of us was prepared for? Wouldn't it be wise to wait until David's career was more established and I had completed my education? Each question chipped away at our joy and confidence, replacing excitement with doubt and defensiveness. Robert was even more direct in his opposition. He took David aside for what he called a serious conversation about family responsibilities and business considerations. While I couldn't hear the specific words, I could see David's posture changing throughout their discussion, his shoulders tensing and his expression growing increasingly troubled. When he returned, he was quiet and distant, clearly struggling, with conflicts between his love for me and pressure from his family. The Christmas dinner itself was a masterclass in passive-aggressive family dynamics. Linda had invited several single women from prominent Millbrook families, seating them strategically around David, while placing me at the far end of the table near elderly relatives who couldn't quite hear the main conversations. Throughout the meal, she steered discussions toward topics that highlighted the other women's accomplishments and social connections, while finding ways to minimize or ignore my contributions to any conversation. The final insult came during dessert, when Linda stood to make a toast about family traditions and the importance of making choices that honored previous generations' sacrifices. Her words were carefully chosen to sound inspirational, while delivering a clear message about disappointment and concern for the family's future. She never mentioned me directly, but everyone present understood that the toast was really about David's engagement and her feelings about his choice of fiancé. David and I left immediately after dinner, both of us too upset to maintain polite facades any longer. The drive to my apartment was filled with tension and unspoken concerns about whether our relationship could survive such determined family opposition. David was torn between his love for me and his loyalty to parents who had raised him and supported his career, while I struggled with growing resentment toward people who seemed determined to make me feel unwelcome and unworthy. That night marked the beginning of a particularly difficult period in our relationship. David felt guilty about his family's behavior, but couldn't bring himself to completely cut ties with them. I felt increasingly isolated and defensive, wondering if I was being selfish by continuing a relationship that caused David such obvious conflict with his family. The stress affected every aspect of our interactions, turning conversations into potential arguments and making us both hyper-aware of class and background differences we had previously been able to navigate. Despite these challenges, we decided to proceed with wedding plans, partly out of love and partly out of stubborn determination not to let external pressure derail our relationship. We chose a small ceremony at a local church with reception at a modest venue that fit our budget and preferences. The Morrison family's lack of enthusiasm for our plans was obvious, but they maintained the pretense of support while making suggestions that would have tripled our costs and transformed our intimate celebration into something more suited to their social expectations. The months leading up to our wedding were filled with constant low-level tension about guest lists, venues, catering choices, and every other detail that seemed to carry deeper meaning about social position and family acceptance. Linda offered to help with planning in ways that felt more like attempts to control the process, while Robert made repeated comments about the importance of starting marriage with proper financial planning and realistic expectations about lifestyle changes. Through all of this family drama, I was also dealing with significant changes in my own life. The stress of wedding planning combined with increased hours at the diner had forced me to pause my online courses temporarily, pushing my degree completion even further into the future. Money was tight as we saved for the wedding and future apartment, making every expense a careful calculation that highlighted the economic gap between our families. What the Morrison family didn't know, and what I had never shared with David, was that during the previous year I had been quietly building something that would eventually change all of our circumstances dramatically. My online business courses had led to an internship at First National Bank, where my analytical skills and attention to detail had quickly earned recognition from senior management. The internship had turned into part-time work, which had evolved into a position with increasing responsibilities in the commercial lending department. While Linda Morrison was introducing me to her friends as David's little waitress girlfriend, I was actually spending my days reviewing loan applications for some of Millbrook's most prominent businesses and families. My supervisor, Margaret Chen, had taken me under her wing and provided mentorship that was rapidly advancing my understanding of commercial finance and lending practices. The irony that the Morrison family's own business was increasingly dependent on bank financing was not lost on me, though I had carefully avoided any involvement in their accounts to prevent conflicts of interest. My work at the bank was beginning to reveal just how precarious the financial situation was for many of Millbrook's established families and businesses. The economic downturn had hit harder than many people realized, and several companies that projected success and stability were actually struggling with significant debt and cash flow problems. Morrison Associates was among the businesses walking an increasingly thin line between solvency and serious financial trouble. As our wedding approached, I found myself living in two completely different worlds. At the diner and in social situations with David's family, I was still seen as the unsuitable girlfriend who had somehow trapped their son into an inappropriate marriage. At the bank, I was developing a reputation as a sharp analyst with excellent instincts for risk assessment and client relations. The disconnect between these two identities was sometimes surreal, particularly when I would finish a shift serving coffee and pie, then drive to the bank to review million-dollar loan applications. David remained unaware of the extent of my banking responsibilities, partly because I wanted to protect him from additional conflict with his family, and partly because I was still building confidence in my new professional identity. The Morrison family's constant undermining of my capabilities had left me hesitant to share successes that might be seen as attempts to prove my worth or challenge their assumptions about my limitations. Our wedding day finally arrived with all the complexity and mixed emotions that had characterized our engagement period. The ceremony itself was beautiful, intimate, and filled with genuine love despite the undercurrent of family tension. Linda Morrison managed to maintain appropriate appearances while making her disappointment clear through tight smiles and carefully neutral comments. Robert's toast at the reception was diplomatically worded, but contained subtle warnings about the why, challenges ahead, and the importance of realistic expectations. The honeymoon provided a blessed reprieve from family dynamics, allowing David and me to reconnect as a couple without external pressures and judgments. We spent a week at a modest beach resort, talking through our concerns about the future and reaffirming our commitment to building a life together based on our shared values rather than other people's expectations. When we returned to Millbrook as a married couple, the dynamic with David's family shifted in ways that were both subtle and significant. Linda now had to acknowledge me as her daughter-in-law rather than a temporary girlfriend, but she approached this role with obvious reluctance and constant suggestions for improvement. Robert began including me in business discussions, though his tone remained patronizing, and his suggestions always seemed designed to highlight my lack of relevant experience or education. The newlywed period also brought increased pressure for me to quit my diner job and find more appropriate employment that better reflected the Morrison family's social standing. Linda made frequent comments about the embarrassment of having a daughter-in-law who worked in food service, while Robert offered to leverage his business connections to find me administrative work at one of his associates' companies. Their suggestions always carried the implication that my current employment was temporary until I could find something more suitable to their standards. What they couldn't have anticipated was that their constant criticism and attempts to reshape my career path would actually strengthen my determination to succeed on my own terms. Every condescending comment about my work ethic, education, or prospects motivated me to work harder at the bank and prove that their assumptions about my capabilities were fundamentally wrong. I began taking on additional responsibilities, volunteering for challenging projects, and building relationships with senior management that would soon pay dividends in ways the Morrison family couldn't imagine. The first year of marriage was a constant balancing act between maintaining harmony with David's family and preserving my own sense of dignity and self-worth. Family dinners became exercises in endurance, where I would smile politely while enduring subtle insults and repeated suggestions for personal improvement. Holiday gatherings felt like performance evaluations where every word and action was scrutinized. for evidence of my unsuitability as a Morrison family member. Through all of this, David tried his best to support me while managing his own complicated relationship with his parents. He began standing up to their more obvious slights and defending my worth more assertively, but the constant tension was wearing on both of us. We started attending fewer family events and spending more time with friends who accepted us as equals. But this selective approach to family relationships created its own problems and guilt. The Morrison family's financial situation continued to deteriorate during this period, though they maintained appearances through careful management of credit and strategic delays in addressing underlying problems. The real estate market in Millbrook remained challenging, with increased competition from larger firms and changing consumer preferences affecting traditional agencies like Morrison Associates. Robert's pride prevented him from acknowledging the severity of their situation or asking for help, while Linda focused on maintaining social appearances rather than addressing practical concerns. Meanwhile, my position at First National Bank was steadily expanding as I demonstrated competence in increasingly complex transactions and client relationships. Margaret Chen continued to mentor me, providing opportunities to work with major commercial accounts and develop expertise in areas that would soon prove directly relevant to the Morrison family's situation. I was building skills and knowledge that would eventually give me power over the very people who had spent months trying to diminish my worth and reshape my identity. The irony was becoming increasingly apparent to me, though I shared my observations with no one. The same family who criticized my education, employment, and prospects was becoming increasingly dependent on the kind of financial institutions where I was building my career. Their business needed credit lines, loan renewals, and favorable terms that were decided by people exactly like me, people they would never have considered worthy of respect or serious attention. As our first wedding anniversary approached, I realized that the constant pressure and criticism from David's family had actually accelerated my professional development in unexpected ways. Their attempts to make me feel inferior had motivated me to excel beyond what I might have achieved without such external pressure. Their suggestions that I was unsuitable for their family had pushed me to build capabilities and credentials that would soon make their opinions irrelevant. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would completely transform the power dynamics within our extended family. The Morrison family's assumption that they could continue treating me as a disappointment while depending on my professional expertise for their survival was about to be tested in ways none of us could have anticipated. What happened next would prove that sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who end up needing your help the most, and that true power comes not from inherited status or social position, but from competence, integrity, and the courage to stand up for yourself when it matters most. The morning after our first anniversary dinner, everything changed in ways I never could have anticipated. David and I had celebrated quietly at home, cooking together and reminiscing about our journey from that late-night diner meeting to building a life as husband and wife. We had deliberately kept the celebration small and private, knowing that any larger gathering would inevitably involve his family and the complex dynamics that came with their presence. I was preparing for another shift at the diner when my phone rang with a call from Margaret Chen at the bank. Her voice carried an unusual tension that immediately caught my attention, despite the early hour and my grogginess from the previous evening's wine. "Emma, I need you to come in early today. We have a situation developing that requires your immediate attention. There's been a significant development with one of our major commercial accounts, and your expertise with their sector makes you the logical point person for managing the response." The urgency in Margaret's voice was unmistakable, though she remained professionally vague about specifics over the phone. In the 18 months I had been working at First National, I had never heard her sound quite so serious about a client matter. My mind immediately began cycling through the various accounts I had been involved with, trying to anticipate which business might be facing the kind of crisis that would require emergency intervention. I called the diner to explain that a family emergency would prevent me from working my shift. A small lie that felt justified given the potential importance of whatever was developing at the bank. David was already gone for an early morning property showing, so I left a note explaining that work had called me in unexpectedly, and that I would update him later about timing for dinner. The drive to First National felt longer than usual as I mentally prepared for whatever challenge awaited. Margaret had been consistently supportive of my professional development, but she was also demanding and precise in her expectations. If she considered a situation serious enough to call me in early, it meant that significant money and potentially jobs were at stake for one of our commercial clients. First National's offices were unusually busy for such an early hour, with several senior staff members already present and engaged in what appeared to be intense discussions. Margaret met me at the elevator with a stack of files and an expression that confirmed the gravity of whatever was unfolding. Morrison Associates submitted an emergency loan application late yesterday evening. Their cash flow situation has deteriorated significantly over the past quarter, and they need immediate credit extension to meet payroll and cover outstanding obligations. The application landed on my desk this morning, and when I saw your name as David Morrison's emergency contact, I realized we have a potential conflict of interest situation that needs careful handling. The words hit me like a physical blow, though I managed to maintain professional composure as Margaret led me to her office. Morrison Associates, David's family business, the company that had been the foundation of their social standing and financial security for 3 decades, was in serious enough trouble to require emergency banking intervention. More significantly, their financial survival now depended on a loan decision that would ultimately require my professional input and recommendation. Margaret closed her office door and gestured for me to sit while she spread the Morrison Associates file across her desk. The documents painted a picture of a business in rapid decline, with revenues dropping consistently over the past 2 years, and expenses remaining stubbornly high due to overhead commitments and debt service obligations that had been manageable during better economic periods. The real estate market downturn had hit Morrison Associates particularly hard because they had specialized in higher-end properties and luxury developments that were now sitting unsold for months longer than projected. Their commission structure, designed for a robust market with quick turnover, left them vulnerable when transaction volumes dropped and average time to sale extended significantly. Robert Morrison had attempted to address the situation through various cost-cutting measures and strategic pivots, but the changes had been too little and too late to prevent the cash flow crisis that now threatened the business's immediate survival. The loan application requested enough credit to cover 3 months of operations, while they implemented more aggressive restructuring and pursued new market opportunities. Margaret's analysis was thorough and sobering. Morrison Associates met some criteria for emergency commercial lending, but their debt-to-revenue ratio was concerning, and their projected recovery timeline seemed optimistic given current market conditions. A traditional loan officer might approve a smaller amount with more restrictive terms, or potentially decline the application entirely pending a more comprehensive business restructuring plan. The conflict of interest implications were complex and unprecedented in my experience at First National. While I had no direct financial stake in Morrison Associates, my marriage to David created obvious personal connections that could influence my professional judgment. Bank policy required disclosure of such relationships, but the specific protocols for handling family business loan applications were somewhat ambiguous. Emma, I need your honest assessment of this application based purely on the financial data and market analysis. I also need to understand whether your relationship with the Morrison family creates any emotional factors that might affect your ability to provide objective professional recommendations. Margaret's question forced me to confront the intersection of my personal and professional lives in ways I had never anticipated. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. For nearly 2 years, the Morrison family had treated me as intellectually and professionally inferior, questioning my education, my career prospects, and my suitability as a family member. Now their business survival depended on exactly the kind of financial expertise they had consistently dismissed as irrelevant to their world. The objective financial analysis was relatively straightforward. Morrison Associates had viable long-term prospects if they could survive the current cash flow crisis and adapt their business model to changing market conditions. Robert Morrison had extensive industry experience and community connections that provided competitive advantages, while David's younger perspective and technology skills could help modernize their operations for evolving customer expectations. However, the loan amount they requested was substantial relative to their current revenue, and their proposed timeline for recovery seemed ambitious given the broader economic climate affecting real estate markets throughout the region. A responsible lending decision would probably involve offering a smaller initial credit line with performance milestones tied to additional funding availability. The personal dynamics were considerably more complicated. Part of me felt satisfaction at being in a position to potentially help or hinder people who had consistently undermined my confidence and self-worth. Another part recognized that David's well-being was directly connected to his family's business success, making this decision personally significant regardless of my feelings about his parents. Margaret waited patiently while I reviewed the financial documents and considered the various factors involved. Her expression remained neutral, but I could sense her watching for signs of how personal considerations might be affecting my professional analysis. The test wasn't just about Morrison & Associates' creditworthiness, but about my ability to separate emotional factors from business judgment. I recommend a modified approval with specific conditions and performance requirements. The business has underlying strengths that justify supporting them through this crisis, but the loan terms should reflect the elevated risk and include mechanisms for protecting the bank's interests if their recovery projections prove overly optimistic. I outlined a lending structure that would provide Morrison & Associates with enough credit to address their immediate crisis while requiring regular financial reporting and specific business plan modifications. The terms were fair but demanding, designed to give them a genuine opportunity for recovery while ensuring that First National's risk exposure remained manageable. Margaret reviewed my recommendations carefully, asking detailed questions about specific provisions and risk mitigation strategies. Her approval of my analysis was evident in her nodding and occasional notes, though she remained focused on the business merits rather than acknowledging the personal complications involved. We'll present this to the loan committee this afternoon. Given the emergency nature of their request, we should have a decision by close of business today. You'll need to recuse yourself from the final vote due to your family connection, but your analysis will carry significant weight in their deliberations. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of preparation for the loan committee meeting, during which I compiled additional market research and refined my recommendations based on comparative data from similar businesses in our portfolio. The professional demands of the situation helped distract from the emotional complexity of potentially controlling my in-laws' financial future. David called during my lunch break to check on my unexpected work situation, clearly puzzled by my vague explanation about an emergency client matter. I found myself in the awkward position of being unable to share information about his family's crisis, while knowing that their financial survival was being decided by committees that included my direct input and recommendation. "How was your property showing this morning?" I asked, deflecting his questions while gathering information about his awareness of the family business situation. "Actually, that's been postponed. Dad asked me to come into the office this afternoon for some kind of family meeting. He sounded pretty stressed on the phone but wouldn't give me details about what's going on." The timing suggested that Robert Morrison was planning to inform his family about the loan application and their precarious financial situation. The meeting would probably involve discussions about potential changes to their lifestyle and business operations, conversations that would be significantly influenced by whatever decision First National reached later that afternoon. "I'll probably be working late today, so don't wait for me for dinner. We can catch up tonight when I get home, and you can tell me about whatever your dad wanted to discuss." The loan committee meeting convened at 3 p.m. in First National's main conference room, with senior management reviewing my analysis alongside applications from several other commercial clients. As planned, I presented my findings but left the room before final deliberations began, maintaining professional distance from the decision-making process while ensuring that my expertise contributed to an informed evaluation. Margaret found me at my desk an hour later with news that the committee had approved a modified version of my recommendations. Morrison and Associates would receive emergency credit sufficient to address their immediate crisis, but with more restrictive terms than they had requested and performance requirements that would require significant changes to their business operations. The loan approval included provisions for regular financial reporting, mandatory business plan modifications, and personal guarantees from Robert Morrison that would put his family's primary residence at risk if the business failed to meet recovery milestones. The terms were designed to give them a genuine opportunity for success while protecting First National's interests and ensuring serious commitment to the restructuring process. Robert Morrison has been notified and asked to come in tomorrow morning to review the terms and complete the paperwork. The credit line will be available immediately upon signed agreement, which should give them enough time to meet their current obligations while developing longer-term solutions. Margaret's update confirmed that the Morrison family crisis would be resolved, at least temporarily, though the loan conditions would require significant adjustments to their lifestyle and business expectations. More importantly for my personal situation, they would eventually learn that their financial salvation had come through the professional expertise of the daughter-in-law they had consistently dismissed as inadequate and unsuitable. The drive home that evening was filled with anticipation about David's family meeting and speculation about how much he had learned about their situation. The emergency loan approval meant that Morrison and Associates would survive their immediate crisis, but the restrictive terms and performance requirements would force acknowledgement of problems that the family had been avoiding or minimizing for months. David's car was already in our driveway when I arrived, along with what appeared to be takeout bags from his favorite Chinese restaurant. He met me at the door with an expression that mixed concern, confusion, and what might have been relief, suggesting that his afternoon family meeting had been both informative and emotionally challenging. "How was your emergency work situation?" he asked as we moved toward the kitchen. "Is everything resolved?" "Everything worked out fine. Just a client situation that needed immediate attention, but we managed to find solutions that satisfied everyone involved. How was your family meeting? You look like it was pretty intense." David's pause suggested he was trying to find appropriate words to describe what had obviously been a difficult conversation with his parents. He began unpacking the takeout containers while organizing his thoughts, clearly processing information that had significantly changed his understanding of his family's circumstances. "Dad finally told me about the business situation. Apparently, they've been struggling financially for longer than I realized, and today they reached some kind of agreement with their bank that will help them get through the immediate crisis. But there are going to be some major changes to how we operate going forward." The carefully neutral way David described the situation suggested that Robert Morrison had provided a sanitized version of events that minimized the severity of their financial problems while acknowledging the need for operational changes. This approach was typical of Robert's management style, maintaining control over information while preparing family members for necessary adjustments without creating unnecessary panic. "What kind of changes are we talking about?" I asked, genuinely curious about how much detail Robert had shared about the loan conditions and their implications for the family's lifestyle and business operations. "Significant cost reductions, changes to our commission structure, probably selling the vacation house in Charleston, maybe downsizing the main office space. Dad says the market downturn hit harder than they anticipated, but that this bank arrangement gives them time to restructure and adapt to new conditions." David's summary confirmed that Robert had presented the situation as a strategic business adjustment rather than an emergency rescue operation, though the specific changes he mentioned indicated that the family's financial situation was more serious than David fully understood. The vacation house sale and office downsizing represented major lifestyle adjustments that would significantly impact their social standing within Millbrook's elite community. That sounds challenging, but it's good that they found solutions and have a plan for moving forward. Are you going to be more involved in the business operations now? Actually, yes. Dad wants me to take on more responsibility for modernizing our marketing and client relations, especially developing online presence and social media strategies. He thinks my perspective on younger buyers and technology could help us capture market segments we've been missing. The expansion of David's role within Morrison Associates represented both opportunity and additional pressure, particularly given the performance requirements attached to their new loan agreement. His success in implementing modernization strategies would directly affect the family's ability to meet recovery milestones and maintain their banking relationship. That night, as David slept beside me, I found myself processing the surreal nature of my situation. Within the span of a single day, I had moved from being the disappointing daughter-in-law who worked at a diner to being the banking professional whose expertise had saved the Morrison family business. The irony was so complete that it felt almost fictional, yet the reality was that their future financial stability now depended on maintaining a positive relationship with exactly the kind of institution where I was building my career. The secret knowledge weighed heavily as I considered how and when to reveal my role in their rescue. The Morrison family's assumption that their salvation had come from impersonal banking bureaucracy would eventually be challenged when they learned that their financial lifeline had been approved based partly on analysis and recommendations from the woman they had spent 2 years trying to convince David to abandon. Over the following weeks, the effects of Morrison and Associates' financial restructuring became increasingly visible in the family's daily operations and social interactions. The vacation house in Charleston was listed for sale, generating gossip within Millbrook's social circles about potential financial difficulties. Linda Morrison's involvement in various charity boards was scaled back as the family reduced discretionary spending and focused resources on business recovery. The changes created obvious stress within the family dynamic, with Linda struggling to maintain social appearances while adapting to reduced circumstances. Her criticism of my employment and lifestyle choices became even more pointed as she dealt with her own insecurities about declining social status. The irony that her family's survival depended on exactly the kind of banking relationships she had always dismissed as beneath their concern seemed lost on her entirely. Robert Morrison threw himself into the business restructuring with characteristic determination, implementing cost reduction measures, and working with David to develop new marketing strategies. The loan conditions required monthly financial reporting to First National, creating regular touchpoints that would eventually bring the family's banking relationship into closer focus. My own position at the bank continued to evolve as Margaret Chen increased my responsibilities and involvement in major commercial accounts. The Morrison and Associates file remained active on my desk as I monitored their progress toward meeting loan conditions and business plan objectives. The unusual situation of having intimate knowledge of a client's family dynamics provided insights that enhanced my ability to assess their recovery prospects and recommend appropriate support strategies. The first monthly reporting meeting between Robert Morrison and First National was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, with Margaret leading the session while I provided analytical support from behind the scenes. I would not be present for the actual meeting due to conflict of interest protocols, but my analysis of their progress would inform the bank's ongoing evaluation of their loan performance and future credit needs. David had mentioned his father's nervousness about the bank meeting, describing Robert's meticulous preparation of financial documents and business plan updates. The pressure to demonstrate compliance with loan conditions and progress toward recovery milestones was clearly affecting the entire family, though they maintained public confidence about their adaptation strategies and future prospects. The afternoon of Robert Morrison's bank meeting, I found myself unusually anxious about outcomes that would affect both my professional responsibilities and personal relationships. Margaret had scheduled our debriefing for immediately after Robert's departure, when she would share her impressions of the meeting and discuss any concerns about Morrison and Associates' performance relative to loan agreement expectations. Emma, Your analysis of their monthly reports has been consistently accurate in predicting their actual performance. Robert Morrison presented a positive picture of their progress, but the underlying numbers suggest they're struggling more than he wants to acknowledge. We may need to consider modifications to their loan terms or additional support structures to ensure successful completion of their recovery plan. Margaret's assessment confirmed what I had suspected from reviewing Morrison Associates' financial reports. While they were meeting minimum loan conditions, their progress toward sustainable profitability remained slower than projected. The family's adaptation to reduced circumstances was proceeding gradually, but market conditions continued to challenge their revenue recovery efforts. "What kind of modifications are you considering?" I asked, knowing that any changes to their loan agreement would require careful analysis of both financial and personal factors affecting the Morrison family's situation. Possibly extending their timeline for meeting certain milestones, or providing additional credit for specific modernization investments that could accelerate their adaptation to current market conditions. The key is finding ways to support their legitimate recovery efforts without enabling continued avoidance of necessary structural changes. Margaret's approach balanced compassion with fiscal responsibility, recognizing that Morrison Associates' long-term success required both financial support and honest acknowledgement of the business realities they faced. The challenge was helping them navigate this transition without undermining the personal accountability that successful recovery would ultimately require. As autumn progressed into winter, the Morrison family's adjustment to their changed circumstances became increasingly apparent in both their business operations and social interactions. Linda Morrison's volunteer activities were reduced to focus on less expensive commitments, while Robert Morrison spent longer hours at the office implementing cost reduction measures and pursuing new client relationships. David's expanded role in the family business provided him with greater insight into their financial challenges and recovery efforts. His reports to me about business developments became more detailed and concerning as he recognized the extent of their difficulties and the ongoing pressure to meet loan obligations. The stress was clearly affecting his relationship with his parents as family discussions increasingly focused on business survival rather than personal matters. The Charleston vacation house sale completed in November, providing Morrison Associates with a significant cash infusion that improved their short-term financial position while representing a major symbolic loss for the family's social standing. Linda Morrison's disappointment about losing the property was evident in her increasingly sharp comments about economic conditions and the challenges facing established families in changing times. Meanwhile, my professional development at First National continued to accelerate as I took on increasingly complex commercial lending responsibilities. Margaret Chen had begun discussing potential promotion opportunities that would formalize my role as a senior analyst with greater authority over major account decisions. The prospect of advancement was exciting, but also highlighted the growing disconnect between my professional success and the Morrison family's continued perception of my limitations. The monthly Morrison Associates review meetings became routine, touchpoints that provided regular updates on their recovery progress and ongoing challenges. Robert Morrison's presentations to the bank remained carefully optimistic, but the underlying financial data revealed a business that was surviving rather than thriving despite his restructuring efforts. By December, it became clear that Morrison and Associates would need additional support to complete their recovery successfully. Their compliance with loan conditions was adequate, but their revenue growth remained below projections, and their profit margins continued to be squeezed by competitive pressures and market conditions. Margaret Chen scheduled a comprehensive review meeting to discuss potential modifications to their loan agreement and additional support options. "Emma, I want you to prepare a detailed analysis of Morrison Associates' performance over the past 6 months, along with recommendations for helping them achieve sustainable recovery. Your understanding of their business model and market position makes you the logical person to develop strategies that could accelerate their return to profitability." Margaret's request meant that I would be designing the financial framework, that could determine whether David's family business survived or failed over the coming year. The responsibility was enormous, particularly given the personal stakes involved and the complex family dynamics that would be affected by whatever recommendations I developed. The analysis required careful consideration of both financial metrics and operational factors that influenced Morrison Associates' competitive position and recovery prospects. Robert Morrison's traditional approach to real estate services was increasingly challenged by technological innovations and changing consumer expectations, while David's modernization efforts showed promise but required time and investment to generate measurable results. My recommendations focused on supporting Morrison Associates' adaptation to market changes, while requiring continued progress toward sustainable business operations. The proposed loan modifications would provide additional credit for technology, investments and marketing initiatives, but with performance milestones tied to revenue growth and market share expansion in their targeted demographic segments. The comprehensive review meeting was scheduled for the first week of January, creating a natural transition point for implementing new support strategies as Morrison Associates entered their second year of recovery efforts. The timing also provided an opportunity for addressing underlying family dynamics that continued to affect their business operations and decision-making processes. As the holidays approached, I found myself anticipating the eventual revelation of my role in the Morrison family's financial salvation. The secret had become increasingly difficult to maintain as their situation evolved and my involvement in their recovery planning expanded. Eventually, the truth would emerge about who had been protecting their interests and designing the strategies that enabled their survival. The stage was set for a confrontation that would completely transform the power dynamics within our extended family, revealing that the daughter-in-law they had consistently dismissed as a disappointment was actually the professional whose expertise had prevented their business failure and financial ruin. Sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones whose futures depend entirely on your competence and goodwill. The comprehensive review meeting that would determine Morrison Associates' future was scheduled for January 8th at 2 p.m. What Robert Morrison didn't know was that his daughter-in-law would be the primary architect of whatever lifeline the bank might offer. As I prepared my final recommendations, the weight of holding his family's financial destiny in my hands felt both empowering and terrifying. Margaret Chen had requested that I attend this meeting as the lead analyst, breaking from our previous protocol of keeping me behind the scenes. The bank's investment in Morrison Associates had grown substantial enough to warrant direct involvement from their most knowledgeable team member, regardless of personal connections that had previously necessitated my discretion. The morning of the meeting, David left early for what he described as a strategy session with his father. Robert Morrison was preparing for what he considered the most important business presentation of his career, unaware that his audience would include the woman he had spent years dismissing as intellectually inferior and professionally irrelevant. I arrived at First National 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting, using the extra time to review my recommendations one final time. The proposal I had developed would offer Morrison Associates a path to genuine recovery, but with conditions. That would require fundamental changes to their business model and family dynamics. The old way of operating, built on established relationships and traditional approaches, would need to evolve into something more adaptive and technologically sophisticated. Margaret Chen met me in her office to discuss strategy for the presentation. Her expression carried the gravity appropriate for a meeting that would determine whether a 30-year-old family business would survive or be forced into closure. The stakes were high not just for the Morrison family, but for First National's reputation as a community-focused institution that supported local businesses through challenging transitions. Robert will be bringing David to this meeting, as his expanded role in the business makes him a key stakeholder in any restructuring decisions. I wanted you to be prepared for the personal dynamics that might emerge when your professional relationship becomes visible to your family members. Margaret's warning highlighted the complexity of the situation I was about to navigate. David, had no idea that his wife had been instrumental in saving his family's business, while Robert Morrison was about to discover that his financial survival depended on the expertise of someone he had consistently treated as unworthy of respect or serious consideration. At exactly 2 p.m., Margaret's assistant escorted Robert and David Morrison into the conference room, where I was already seated with loan documents and financial analyses spread across the polished mahogany table. The moment when David's eyes met, mine was electric with confusion and surprise, while Robert Morrison's expression shifted from confident preparation to visible shock as he recognized my presence. "Mr. Morrison, I believe you know Emma Patterson, our senior commercial lending analyst. Emma has been the primary reviewer of your account since your initial application, and she'll be presenting our recommendations for your continued recovery support." Margaret's introduction was professionally neutral, but the implications were unmistakable. Robert Morrison was learning that the woman he had dismissed as a diner waitress with community college dropout credentials was actually a senior banking professional with authority over his family's financial future. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for 3 years was reversing in real time. David's confusion was palpable as he processed the revelation that his wife had been involved in his family's business crisis without his knowledge. His expression cycled through surprise, hurt, and something that might have been pride as he began to understand the scope of my professional responsibilities and expertise. "Emma, I had no idea you were involved in commercial lending. Why didn't you tell me about working with my family's business?" David's question carried personal hurt beneath its professional curiosity, highlighting the complications that had led me to maintain secrecy about my role in their financial rescue. Bank confidentiality policies prevent discussing specific client relationships, even with family members, unless disclosure is specifically authorized by the account holder. Today marks the first time your father has been informed about my involvement in your loan analysis and recommendations. My response was technically accurate while avoiding the more complex emotional reasons I had maintained secrecy about my growing professional influence over his family's circumstances. The truth was that I had wanted to protect both David and myself from the complicated dynamics that would inevitably emerge when the Morrison family learned about my actual capabilities and position. Robert Morrison's recovery from his initial shock was evident as his businessman instincts reasserted themselves. Despite years of treating me as intellectually and professionally inferior, he was pragmatic enough to recognize that his family's survival now required maintaining positive relationships with people who controlled their access to credit and financial support. "Emma, I had no idea about your position here at the bank. Perhaps we should discuss how your analysis of our situation has informed the recommendations you mentioned." His tone carried forced respect that contrasted sharply with the patronizing attitude he had maintained throughout our previous interactions. The man who had suggested I find more appropriate employment through his business connections was now addressing me as a financial professional whose expertise would determine his company's fate. I opened the presentation folder that contained months of analysis and strategic planning designed to give Morrison Associates the best possible chance for sustainable recovery. The recommendations represented hundreds of hours of work developing solutions that balanced the bank's risk management needs with genuine support for a struggling family business. Morrison Associates has demonstrated compliance with current loan conditions, but your revenue recovery has been slower than initially projected. Our analysis suggests that additional support, structured appropriately, could accelerate your return to sustainable profitability while protecting the bank's investment in your success. The proposal I outlined included extended timeline milestones, additional credit for technology and marketing investments, and restructured reporting requirements that would provide more flexibility while maintaining accountability for business performance. The terms were generous considering Morrison Associates' current financial position, but included safeguards that would protect First National if recovery efforts continued to fall short of projections. Throughout my presentation, I watched Robert Morrison's expression shift from surprise to grudging respect as he recognized the sophistication and thoroughness of the analysis I had prepared. The recommendations demonstrated intimate understanding of their business challenges and market position, combined with creative solutions that addressed their specific needs while managing associated risks appropriately. David's reaction was more emotionally complex, as he processed both professional admiration for work he hadn't known I was capable of and personal confusion about why I had maintained secrecy about such significant involvement in his family's crisis. His expression suggested internal struggle between pride in my capabilities and hurt about being excluded from knowledge that directly affected his own future. "These recommendations appear very generous," Robert said carefully. "What specific conditions would be attached to the additional support you're proposing?" The conditions I outlined focused on measurable business performance improvements rather than personal guarantees or additional collateral requirements. Morrison Associates would need to demonstrate progress in market diversification, technology adoption, and operational efficiency improvements, but the milestones were designed to be achievable with dedicated effort rather than impossibly demanding. More significantly, the loan modifications included provisions for quarterly strategic planning sessions that would require participation from both Robert and David Morrison in developing adaptive business strategies. These meetings would essentially institutionalize my ongoing involvement in their business decision-making process, creating regular opportunities for the professional relationship that had previously been hidden behind confidentiality protocols. Margaret Chen concluded the formal presentation by emphasizing First National's commitment to supporting local businesses through challenging economic transitions, while noting that the modified loan terms represented a significant investment in Morrison & Associates' future success. The bank was essentially doubling down on their survival, but with clear expectations for measurable progress toward sustainable operations. The paperwork completion process required nearly an hour of document review and signature collection, during which the three family members present had opportunities to process the implications of what they had learned. Robert Morrison maintained professional composure while clearly struggling to reconcile his previous perceptions of my capabilities with the reality of my actual expertise and authority. David's emotional processing was more visible as he alternated between asking technical questions about the loan modifications and shooting confused glances in my direction. The husband, who had spent 3 years defending my worth to his family, was discovering that his wife possessed professional credentials and influence that exceeded anything his parents had ever acknowledged or respected. As the meeting concluded and documents were finalized, Margaret Chen made arrangements for the first quarterly strategic planning session in April, creating a formal framework for my continued involvement in Morrison & Associates' recovery efforts. The relationship that had begun with secret analysis and behind-the-scenes recommendations would now become an acknowledged professional partnership with regular collaborative interactions. Robert Morrison's handshake as we concluded the meeting carried grudging respect that felt surreal after years of patronizing dismissal. The man who had questioned my intelligence and suggested more appropriate career paths was now expressing gratitude for professional expertise that had prevented his business failure and financial ruin. "Thank you for your analysis and recommendations, Emma. I look forward to working together during our recovery planning process." His words were carefully chosen to maintain dignity while acknowledging the complete reversal of our professional relationship. The woman he had considered unsuitable for his family had become someone whose continued goodwill was essential for their financial survival and business success. The drive home with David was filled with tension and unspoken questions as he processed revelations that had fundamentally altered his understanding of both my professional capabilities and the family dynamics we had navigated for years. His silence suggested internal struggle between multiple conflicting emotions as he tried to reconcile new information with his existing perceptions and experiences. When we finally arrived home, David's first words carried hurt and confusion that I had anticipated but hoped to avoid. "Why didn't you tell me you were working on my family's loan application? I've been worried sick about their financial situation, and you knew exactly what was happening the entire time." His question was entirely fair, though the answer involved complex considerations about professional confidentiality, family dynamics, and my own emotional protection during a period when his parents' criticism of my capabilities had been particularly intense and hurtful. Bank confidentiality rules prevented me from discussing your family's financial situation, even with you. But honestly, there were also personal reasons for maintaining secrecy. Your parents have spent 3 years telling me I'm intellectually and professionally inadequate. I wasn't ready to reveal my actual role in their rescue until I felt confident about my own position and capabilities. David's expression softened as he recognized the emotional complexity of my situation. The man who had consistently defended my worth to his family was beginning to understand how their criticism had affected my willingness to share professional successes that might have challenged their assumptions about my limitations. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, and I'm grateful that you were in a position to help my family when they needed it most. But I wish you had felt safe sharing this with me, instead of carrying the burden alone for so many months. His response demonstrated the emotional maturity and genuine partnership that had attracted me to him originally, while acknowledging the family dynamics that had created barriers to open communication about my professional development and growing expertise. Over the following weeks, news of my role in Morrison Associates financial rescue spread through Millbrook's social circles with the inevitable speed of small-town gossip. The revelation that the community college dropout who worked at Rosie's diner was actually a senior banking professional with authority over major commercial loans created significant buzz among families who had previously dismissed me as socially and professionally irrelevant. Linda Morrison's reaction to learning about my involvement in her family's rescue was particularly complex, involving wounded pride, grudging gratitude, and obvious discomfort with having misjudged someone so completely. Her previous comments about my lack of education and career prospects were now revealed as embarrassingly inaccurate assessments of someone whose expertise had prevented their financial ruin. The first family dinner after the loan modification meeting was unlike any previous gathering, with conversation dynamics completely altered by new awareness of my professional capabilities and ongoing involvement in their business recovery. Linda's typical criticisms and suggestions for personal improvement were notably absent, replaced by careful politeness that acknowledged changed power dynamics without explicitly admitting previous mistakes. Robert Morrison's approach to our relationship evolved toward genuine professional respect, as he recognized that my continued support would be essential for successful completion of their recovery plan. The quarterly strategic planning sessions meant that his business decisions would be subject to review and input from someone he had previously considered unqualified to offer opinions about career choices or financial planning. David's expanded role in Morrison and Associates took on new significance as he became the family member most directly involved in implementing the modernization strategies that my loan analysis had identified as crucial for their competitive position. His technology skills and understanding of younger consumer preferences became valuable assets rather than departures from traditional business approaches. The quarterly strategic planning session in April provided our first formal opportunity to collaborate as acknowledged professional partners rather than hidden analyst and unknowing client. The meeting took place in First National's main conference room, with Morrison and Associates financial performance and future planning as the primary agenda items. Robert Morrison's presentation demonstrated genuine progress in implementing the operational changes that had been identified as necessary for sustainable recovery. Revenue growth remained modest but consistent, while cost reduction efforts had improved their profit margins and cash flow stability. David's modernization initiatives were beginning to generate measurable results in market reach and client engagement. My analysis of their progress was cautiously optimistic, noting areas of improvement while identifying ongoing challenges that would require continued attention and adaptive strategies. The frank discussion of business realities that followed represented a level of professional engagement that would have been impossible under our previous family dynamic. More significantly, the meeting established a collaborative working relationship that transcended the personal tensions that had previously defined our interactions. Robert Morrison's questions and David's contributions were focused on business outcomes rather than family politics, creating space for productive problem-solving without the emotional baggage that had complicated previous conversations. As spring progressed into summer, Morrison Associates' recovery continued to show steady progress toward the sustainability milestones that would eventually allow them to operate without emergency banking support. The business model adaptations were proving effective, while the family's adjustment to reduced circumstances had stabilized into a more realistic lifestyle that matched their actual financial position. The most significant transformation, however, was in the family dynamics that had been built on assumptions and hierarchies that were no longer sustainable. Linda Morrison's recognition that her daughter-in-law possessed expertise and influence that exceeded her own created opportunities for genuine relationship building that had been impossible when their interactions were defined by presumed superiority and inadequacy. Robert Morrison's professional respect for my capabilities extended into acknowledgement that his previous assessments of my intelligence and potential had been fundamentally wrong. The man who had questioned my suitability for his family was now seeking my professional advice and expressing gratitude for expertise that had prevented their business failure. David's pride in my professional accomplishments was evident in his willingness to discuss my work with family and friends, sharing details about my banking career and expertise that he had previously been unable to appreciate or understand. The husband who had defended my worth based on personal qualities was now able to point to professional achievements that commanded respect from his family and social circle. The final loan review meeting in September confirmed that Morrison and Associates had successfully completed their recovery program and qualified for conventional commercial lending terms that would allow them to operate without emergency support or intensive monitoring. The business that had been on the verge of failure 18 months earlier was now positioned for sustainable growth and continued success. Margaret Chen's commendation of my work on the Morrison and Associates account included recognition for managing complex personal and professional dynamics while maintaining the analytical objectivity necessary for sound lending decisions. The successful outcome had enhanced my reputation within First National's senior management and created opportunities for advancement into more senior analytical roles. As I drove home from that final review meeting, I reflected on the complete transformation of circumstances that had begun with a family's attempt to exclude and diminish someone they considered unworthy of their respect. The people who had called me the disappointment had discovered that their survival depended entirely on my professional competence and personal integrity. The irony was perfect and complete. The community college dropout who worked at a diner had possessed the expertise to save the family business of people who thought they were superior in every way that mattered. Sometimes the biggest surprise isn't who succeeds, but who turns out to have been succeeding all along while others were too blinded by their own assumptions to notice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.